Now let's have a look at some observations that suggest possible functional roles for the basal ganglia. The cognitive deficits that result from physical damage or physiological problems with a structure are often a valuable source of information, as we've already seen in the cases of the cortex, hippocampus, and thalamus. Another source of information is experiments that monitor the activity of dopaminergic neurons in monkeys during live behavior. And a third is observations of some anatomical and physiological factors that are involved in addiction. In human patients, there are three deficits that appear to be connected with basal ganglia problems. Parkinson's disease is well known. The most obvious symptoms are problems initiating voluntary motor movements. So movements become slower and harder to make, and eventually it degenerates into a kind of paralysis. But cognitive symptoms can also be present. In some cases, there's trouble remembering the names of people they've recently met, or remembering the flow of a conversation, or a tendency to misplace things. In hemibalism, there are wild, uncontrollable flinging motions of the arms and legs inserted into the intended behaviors. Tourette's symptoms are tics, or brief, stereotyped behaviors that are inserted into the behavior that the Tourette's patient is trying to carry out. These tics can be simple, like eye blinking or nose twitching, more complex tics like head shaking, throwing motions, uttering phrases, or very complex tics. One Tourette's patient, if they saw various different people while out walking, the experience could initiate a tic in which the different mannerisms of the different people were all imitated in quick succession. Now, if we have a look at the basal ganglia circuitry that's affected in these diseases, in the case of Parkinson's disease, the symptoms seem to be connected with a degeneration of the dopamine neurons in the SNC. Now, one thing that's going to be affected by that type of degeneration is the management of the relative activity of the direct and indirect pathways. And in particular, the activity in the indirect pathway will tend to be higher because the inhibition of the D2 neurons will be reduced. The higher indirect pathway activity will increase the activity of the GPI-SNR, and that's going to result in increased inhibition of the thalamus and less cortical activity. In the case of hemibalism, the symptoms are associated with damage to the subthalamic nucleus. In that situation, a probable result would be a decrease in GPI-SNR activity, a decrease in the inhibition of the thalamus, and therefore too much activity in the thalamocortical loop. In the case of Tourette's, relief of symptoms can occur in response to a drug called haloperidol that reduces the effects of dopamine, which suggests that ultimately it's an excess of dopamine that perhaps is responsible for the symptoms of Tourette's. If the dopamine is increased, then what's going to happen ultimately is there's going to be reduced inhibition of the thalamus. So in general, damage to the basal ganglia seems to result in loss of ability to initiate behaviors or loss of ability to carry out a behavior without interference from undesired behaviors, and a lot of this has to do with the balance between the direct and the indirect pathways. It's also of interest to look at the activity of dopaminergic neurons during learning. Individual neurons were monitored in a monkey brain while the monkey was learning and performing a task. The task procedure was that the monkey first saw an image that indicated the type of task to be performed, and then a little later heard a tone which indicated that the task should begin. If the task was completed correctly, the monkey received a reward like fruit juice. When a new task was being learned, a burst of dopamine firing was observed when the reward was given. But after the task had been learned, there was actually a burst of dopamine firing when the trigger tone was heard, but not at the time of the reward. if the reward wasn't given when expected, there was a dip in dopamine activity when the reward should have been available, which indicates quite strongly that dopamine firing has a significant role in learning, and in particular in rewards. When a rat was wired so that electrodes were placed in its nucleus accumbens, or its ventral striatum, and the rat was given a lever which it could use to stimulate its nucleus accumbens, then the rat pressed the lever frequently, not even stopping to eat or drink, which is seen as a kind of an analogy of addiction. And it has also been observed that almost every drug to which humans can become addicted tends to increase dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens. So, what is the role or roles of the basal ganglia? It's been believed for a long while that they have a role in behavior selection. And it's also clear that there's a role in rewards, especially in the case of the ventral basal ganglia. So in summary, the basal ganglia is a collection of nuclei with different types of projection neurons, although predominantly inhibitory GABAergic neurons. The basal ganglia is viewed as a single anatomical system because it's got a pronounced pattern of internal and external connectivity. And it appears to play an important role in selecting behaviors and in rewards that are involved in learning new behaviors.